There is a single verse in the Bible that has produced more theological controversy, more competing interpretations, and more outright confusion than almost any other passage in the entire text. It is not in Revelation. It is not a prophecy about the end of the world. It is 4 lines in the Gospel of Matthew, spoken by Jesus himself, about when the end of the age would arrive. Matthew 24:34. Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. For 2,000 years, that sentence has been a problem. Jesus appears to be saying that everything he just described, wars, famines, earthquakes, the sun going dark, the Son of Man coming in the clouds, would happen within the lifetime of the people standing in front of him. In the 1st century, before that generation died, they died, and the world didn't end. Scholars have been trying to explain that gap ever since. Some have concluded Jesus was simply wrong. Others have argued the whole passage is metaphor. Others have reinterpreted generation to mean something it has never meant in any other context in the entire New Testament. And a small but growing group of biblical scholars has arrived at a 4th explanation, one that takes the text completely at face value and argues that everything Jesus predicted did in fact happen exactly when he said it would. To understand why Matthew 24:34 is so difficult, you have to understand what surrounds it. The chapter is known as the Olivet discourse, a long prophetic speech Jesus delivers to his disciples on the Mount of Olives, 2 days before his arrest. The disciples have just pointed out the grandeur of the Jerusalem temple. Jesus responds by telling them the temple is going to be destroyed, not one stone left on another. The disciples then ask 2 questions. When will this happen? And what will be the sign of the end of the age? What follows is one of the most detailed prophetic passages in the New Testament. Jesus describes wars and rumors of wars, nation rising against nation, famines, earthquakes, persecution of believers, a great tribulation unlike anything in history, the sun darkening, the moon failing to give its light, and finally the Son of Man appearing in the clouds with great power and glory. Then he says, "This generation will not pass away until all these things happen." Theological stakes are enormous. If Jesus was predicting events that were supposed to happen in the 1st century and didn't, then either he was mistaken or he wasn't who Christians believe him to be. That's the reason the verse has generated 2 millennia of tortured interpretation. The options that most scholars have reached for are uncomfortable. Redefine generation to mean a race of people, or an era, or an unspecified future time, anything to make the timeline work, or accept that the passage is symbolic and not predictive at all. Neither answer has been satisfying. The word for generation in Greek is genia. In every other place it appears in Matthew, it refers to the people alive at the time of speaking, always, without exception. In the mid-20th century, a small number of theologians began developing what would eventually become a formal school of interpretation called preterism, from the Latin praeter, meaning past. Their core argument was straightforward. Stop trying to make the timeline work by redefining the words. Take the words at face value and ask a different question. What if these events already happened? The most rigorous modern version of this argument was laid out by scholar and theologian R.C. Sproul in his 1998 book, The Last Days According to Jesus, and more extensively by theologian Kenneth Gentry and historian Gary DeMar. Their position is called full preterism or partial preterism, depending on which events they place in the 1st century. The argument goes like this. In 66 CE, the Jewish-Roman War began. In 70 CE, the Roman general Titus besieged Jerusalem. What followed was, by any historical measure, one of the most catastrophic events in the ancient world. The historian Josephus, an eyewitness, recorded over 1 million people dead, the temple burned to the ground, and the city destroyed so completely that the Romans plowed over its foundations. Not one stone of the temple was left on another, exactly as Jesus had predicted. The question the preterist scholars asked was, what if that's the event? What if the tribulation Jesus described, the darkening of the sun and moon, the coming of the Son of Man in the clouds, what if all of that was apocalyptic language describing the destruction of Jerusalem and the end of the Old Covenant age? Not a literal astronomical event, a cataclysmic historical one, described in the symbolic language that Jewish prophets had used for centuries. The imagery in Matthew 24, the sun going dark, the moon not giving light, the stars falling, the powers of heaven being shaken, was not invented by Jesus. It was drawn directly from the Hebrew prophets, and in the original context, it was never about literal astronomy. In Isaiah 13, God pronounces judgment on Babylon. The stars of heaven and their constellations will not show their light. The rising sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. Babylon fell in 539 BCE. The sun and moon did not literally go dark. The language was symbolic, the collapse of a political and cosmic order, expressed in the prophetic idiom of the ancient Near East. The same imagery appears in Ezekiel 32, describing the fall of Egypt, in Amos 8, describing judgment on Israel, in Joel 2, which Peter quotes in Acts 2 and applies to events happening on the day of Pentecost, in the 1st century. When 1st century Jews heard Jesus describe the sun going dark and the Son of Man coming in the clouds, they were not picturing a literal end of the physical universe. They were hearing the language of divine judgment, the same language their scriptures had used for centuries to describe God acting in history. Preterist scholars argue that modern readers have stripped that language of its original context and turned it into something the original audience would not have recognized. The historian Josephus, writing in the decades immediately after, described phenomena that accompanied the siege of Jerusalem: a star resembling a sword standing over the city, a comet that persisted for a year, fires that burned spontaneously in the temple courts, and a voice heard in the sanctuary saying, "Let us depart hence." Josephus was not a Christian. He had no interest in making the events match Jesus' prophecy, but his account of the Jewish war reads, at points, like a commentary on Matthew 24. He describes the tribulation as unprecedented in its horror. His own phrase was that no other city had suffered such calamities. He records that those who fled the city survived, and those who stayed were killed or enslaved, echoing Jesus' instruction in Matthew 24:16 for those in Judea to flee to the mountains when they saw the abomination of desolation. The temple was destroyed in August of 70 CE. The destruction was total. The Romans melted the gold fixtures of the temple, and the molten gold ran into the cracks between the stones. Roman soldiers pried the stones apart to recover it, leaving, literally, not one stone on another. The most difficult part of the preterist reading for most people is the phrase, "the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory." This sounds unambiguously like a literal, visible, physical return of Jesus. How does that fit into a 1st century fulfillment? The answer, preterist scholars argue, lies in the source text. Jesus is quoting Daniel 7:13, one of the most important passages in Jewish apocalyptic literature. In Daniel's vision, one like a son of man comes with the clouds of heaven and approaches the Ancient of Days. He is given dominion, glory, and a kingdom. The movement in that vision is not downward, from heaven to earth. It is upward, from earth to heaven. The Son of Man comes to God, not to mankind. It is an enthronement scene, not a descent scene, and in the context of Matthew 24, preterist scholars argue, Jesus is describing his vindication, the moment when his resurrection and the destruction of the system that rejected him would demonstrate to the world that he had been right. The clouds are the language of divine authority, not a flight itinerary. This interpretation was not invented by 20th century scholars trying to solve a theological puzzle. It was held by significant portions of the early church. The theologian John Chrysostom, writing in the 4th century, understood much of Matthew 24 as referring to the fall of Jerusalem. The preterist interpretation is not without critics, and the criticisms are serious. The most significant is that Matthew 24 appears to describe a global event. Every eye will see him. In the parallel passage in Revelation, all the nations of the earth will mourn. 1st century Roman Palestine, however catastrophic, was not visible to every nation. Partial preterists like R.C. Sproul draw a distinction between the events of Matthew 24, which they see as fulfilled in 70 CE, and the final resurrection and return of Christ described elsewhere in the New Testament, which they place in the future. Full preterists argue that all of it is already past. Neither view is currently mainstream in evangelical Christianity, where the dominant framework reads Matthew 24 as referring to a still future tribulation. But the debate has grown more serious in academic biblical studies. Scholars who previously dismissed preterism as a fringe position have had to engage with its textual arguments, particularly the problem of genia and the use of apocalyptic language in the Hebrew prophets. New Testament scholar N.T. Wright, one of the most widely respected biblical historians in the world, has argued that Matthew 24 is primarily about the destruction of Jerusalem, a position he lays out in Jesus and the Victory of God, published in 1996. Wright does not call himself a preterist, but his interpretation of the Olivet discourse aligns closely with the preterist reading of the historical events, and his academic credibility has forced the conversation into the mainstream in ways it wasn't before. If the preterist reading is correct, even partially, the implications are significant. The most common objection to Christianity among skeptics and former believers is precisely the failed prophecy argument. Jesus said this generation would see all these things. They didn't. Therefore, the prophecy failed. This objection is so common, it has its own entry in atheist apologetics literature. The preterist response is that the prophecy didn't fail. It was fulfilled, in precise historical detail, within 40 years of when it was given. The temple was destroyed. Jerusalem fell. The generation Jesus addressed did not pass away before those things happened. What modern readers have done is import a 21st century Western literalism onto a 1st century Jewish apocalyptic text and then been confused when it doesn't match their expectations. The debate is not settled, but it is more serious, more textually grounded, and more historically informed than the popular conversation suggests. And for the millions of people who have walked away from faith specifically because of Matthew 24:34, the preterist argument is one that most of them have never encountered. The reason Matthew 24:34 has been so destabilizing for so long is that it was treated as a binary problem. Either the words mean what they say and Jesus was wrong, or the words don't mean what they say and the text is unreliable. Those two options have driven more people out of faith and kept more skeptics from engaging seriously with Christianity than almost any other theological problem. What the historical and textual scholarship shows is that there is a third option, and it was visible to careful readers long before it became controversial. Take the words at face value. Take the 1st century Jewish context seriously. Understand that coming in the clouds was not a flight path, but a theological statement about authority and judgment. Understand that apocalyptic language in the Hebrew prophets was never about literal astronomy. And then look at what actually happened in 70 CE. N.T. Wright's contribution to this debate has been particularly important because he approaches it as a historian rather than as a defender of any theological tradition. His argument is simply that if you want to understand what Jesus meant, you have to understand what Jesus' audience would have heard. And a 1st century Jewish audience, steeped in the prophetic tradition, would have heard Matthew 24 very differently than a 21st century reader looking for signs of a future apocalypse. The verse hasn't changed, the history hasn't changed. What changes is the interpretive framework, and with it, one of the oldest and most persistent objections to the reliability of the New Testament. The debate over Matthew 24:34 is not over. It plays out today in academic journals, seminary classrooms, and YouTube comment sections with equal intensity. N.T. Wright's position has gained significant ground in mainstream biblical scholarship. Preterist theology has grown from a fringe position into a recognized school of interpretation, with its own academic literature and formal theological infrastructure. The Temple Mount in Jerusalem still stands, now occupied by the Dome of the Rock, built on the foundations of what was destroyed in 70 CE. The Western Wall, the last remnant of the temple complex, draws millions of visitors each year. People press written prayers into the cracks between those ancient stones, the same stones that Jesus pointed to when he said not one would be left on another. He said a generation would see it. A generation did. Whether that resolves the question depends on who you ask, but it is no longer a question with only two answers.